Cain Mercer had expected her to cry. He had expected fists on the oak panel. He had expected the particular kind of desperate bargaining that people fell into when they realized the door was no longer theirs to open. He had brought a woman to his mountain estate against her will, driven 4 hours north through the early October sleet, with her sitting rigid in the back seat of his armored Escalade, and he had turned the lock on the outside of the study door himself. He had done this expecting the standard sequence: shock, then grief, then the small shattering sounds of someone realizing their situation. June Hartley had reorganized his bookshelves. By genre, then by publication year within each genre. She had also, apparently, located his Q2 capital expenditure filings and corrected their placement, because when Mercer opened the door on the evening of the second day, she was sitting on the floor surrounded by a careful arrangement of quarterly reports, a red mechanical pencil behind her ear, her laptop balanced on her knees. She looked up at him the way she might look up from her own desk at a slightly inconvenient question. Not fear, not fury, pure administrative neutrality. Your Q2 filing was between the municipal tax records and a 2019 golf club membership, she said. I put it with the rest of the fiscal year. You're welcome. Mercer stood in the doorway of his own locked room and said nothing. He looked terrible. She registered it the same way she registered everything, clinically cataloging details. The bespoke charcoal suit was wrinkled badly at the elbows and knees, his tie had been pulled loose and forgotten, and the shadows under his eyes had the dense, bruised quality of a man who hadn't slept in more than 40 hours. He was holding a glass of bourbon with the looseness of someone who had stopped tasting it several drinks ago. He was 42 years old, broad-shouldered, and scarred in the particular patchwork way that suggested a biography that had never once been safe. He ran Mercer Holdings, a legitimate real estate development company with a portfolio worth $800 million, and something else. Something that only appeared in the books as irregular wire transfers and phantom vendors and cash movements that left no clean paper trail. Or so he thought. June had found the paper trail in week 1. She had said nothing for 2 weeks and 4 days. You're not going to ask me why you're here, Mercer said finally. It wasn't a question. I know why I'm here. June set the mechanical pencil down. I was present at the shooting at the Denver office. I'm a liability. You can't let me walk around unsupervised until you determine how much I know and what I'll do with it. She tilted her head slightly. How am I doing? The muscle in his jaw worked once. Your Denver warehouse property, June said, pulling up a screen on her laptop and turning it to face him. The Route 9 facility. It has a $340,000 gap in the Q3 operating costs. I've been trying to find it. The Wi-Fi password would help if you're willing. The silence stretched. Mercer looked at the screen, then at her, then at the bourbon in his hand as though he'd forgotten it was there. You watched me shoot a man in the parking garage, he said, his voice low and careful. And you want to talk about operating costs. I'm a forensic accountant, Mr. Mercer. You hired me to find the gaps. June closed the laptop with a soft click. There are quite a few of them. If you plan to keep me here indefinitely, we might as well be productive. He left without a word. The door locked. June let out one long, controlled breath and sat very still until her hands stopped trembling. The Wi-Fi password arrived the next morning, written on a note card and slipped under the door by Agnes, the estate's housekeeper, who communicated exclusively through small impersonal gestures and refused eye contact. June connected her laptop to the local server, opened the encrypted ledgers she hadn't been meant to see, and began to work. Mercer came back that afternoon carrying a second laptop and a folder thick enough to double as a doorstop. He pulled a chair to the writing desk without being invited and sat down heavily. There was an entire oak desk's worth of professional distance between them in a normal office. Here, their knees were 8 inches apart, and June was acutely aware of the warmth radiating from him when he leaned over to authorize the encrypted partition. Patterson, June said, 40 minutes into the silence. She turned her laptop toward him. Garrett Patterson, your logistics coordinator for the Route 9 facility." Mercer looked at the spreadsheet. It was annotated in her small, precise handwriting, columns color-coded, discrepancies flagged in red. "He's been timing your shipment manifests to match your competitors' bid submissions," June continued, tracing a line of figures with her finger. "Every time you move product through the northern corridor, Patterson files a maintenance delay, just long enough to trigger a customs hold. Someone's paying him for the schedule. The gap in the Q3 costs is his cut." Mercer leaned closer to look at the numbers, his shoulder pressed against hers. He went very still. So did June. She kept her eyes on the screen. His breathing had slowed, and she could feel the exhaustion radiating from him the way heat radiates from a building that has been burning quietly for days. Not dramatic, not visible from the outside, but structurally threatening. "I took his daughter to her confirmation ceremony last year," Mercer said quietly. The anger she'd expected wasn't there, just a flat, bottomless tired. "His wife was sick. I covered the hospital bills." June looked at the numbers, at the clean, brutal math of betrayal reduced to a spreadsheet. "Loyalty depreciates," she said, "especially when it's purchased with someone else's emergency." Mercer turned his head to look at her. They were close. She could see the pale scar that ran from his jaw to his collarbone, old, faded to silver, the souvenir of a history he hadn't disclosed in the terms of her engagement. His eyes were dark and careful, doing the same thing she did with numbers, cataloging, assessing, trying to find the variable that didn't fit. "Why aren't you afraid of me?" he asked. It was so direct that it startled her. "I did the math," June said after a moment. "Screaming has a 0% success rate with you. Bargaining requires leverage I don't have yet. So," she turned back to the screen, "the numbers." He was quiet. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed, a short, rough sound, entirely humorless but real. "I'll handle Patterson," he said, standing. The professional distance slammed back into place as he stepped away from the desk, his expression folding back into the controlled blankness he wore for the rest of the world. "Mr. Mercer." He stopped at the door. "You haven't slept. You're making errors in judgment. The Patterson decision should wait until you have." She didn't look up from the screen. "That's not a suggestion from a hostage. That's an observation from the person auditing your ledgers." He didn't answer. He walked out, the lock engaged. But this time June noticed the thud of it was softer than before, like a door being shut against the cold rather than a cage being sealed. 4 days later, at 2:40 in the morning, the lock clicked back. June was awake. The October storm had come down from the peaks with extraordinary malice, ice sheeting against the reinforced glass windows, the mountain outside disappearing behind a wall of moving white. She had been lying in the dark running figures behind her closed eyes the way she'd done since she was 9 years old, and numbers were the only thing that made the world feel like it had rules. The door opened. Mercer stood in the frame, no jacket. His white dress shirt was soaked through with rain and something darker, a spreading stain across his left side the color of old rust, the kind of color that didn't come from the outside of a man. He didn't speak. He took one step into the room. His knee buckled. He caught the doorframe and slid down it until he hit the floor with a heavy, wet sound. June was out of bed before her mind had processed the image. No scream. 3 years of following the paper trails of violent men had given her a strange immunity to the theatrics of crisis. What kicked in instead was the same cold clarity that let her find a discrepancy in a 250,000-line spreadsheet. Identify the problem, identify the resources, act. She dropped to her knees beside him. His right hand was clamped over his left ribs, blood seeping between his fingers, his skin the color of old paper. "Patterson had a brother," Mercer said, his voice ground down to gravel. "I didn't account for him." "Stop talking. Move your hand." "It's bad, June." "I said move it." She pried his fingers away, the wound beneath it a deep, ragged graze along the rib line, ugly and soaking but not a killing shot. "Not yet. Can you stand?" "Maybe." "Then get up. Bathroom now." It took both of them, and longer than either would admit. She pulled his arm over her shoulders and bore more of his weight than she would have thought she could. He left dark smears on the doorframe, on the tile, on the edge of the sink when she finally got him seated on the closed lid of the toilet. The first aid kit was military grade, which made sense for a man like Mercer. She found it in the bottom cabinet, ripped it open, and laid out what she needed with the same systematic efficiency she used to build an audit trail. Iodine, gauze, a suture kit, medical tape. She'd never stitched anything that wasn't paper. She was going to now. Take the shirt off. He tried. His left arm was useless with the wound. June picked up the trauma shears and cut the shirt down the seam, peeling the ruined fabric away. His torso was a topographic map of old violence, pale scars in various stages of fade, the puckered circles of old bullet wounds, the long knife scar she'd catalogued the first time she saw it. She'd noted it the way she noted everything. A data point, a fact, something that told her who she was actually working for. She opened the iodine. "This is going to be unpleasant," she said. "I've had worse." She poured it anyway. Mercer's entire body went rigid, a sound forcing its way through his clenched teeth. His right hand shot out and gripped her hip, fingers finding purchase through the thin cotton of her sleep shirt, and he held on, not pulling, just anchoring himself to the only solid thing in the room. "Breathe," June said. She hadn't softened her voice on purpose. It came out softer anyway. "Keep breathing. It's clean. I have to stitch it now." The needle was curved. Her hands were shaking. She knelt in front of him to get the angle right and looked up at his face, grey with pain, damp, his eyes half closed. "Look at me," she said. He lifted his gaze to hers. "Keep looking at me, not at the needle." She pushed the curved needle through his skin. His breath hitched sharply. His grip on her hip tightened to the edge of pain, but he didn't look away from her. She didn't look away from him. The bathroom was very quiet. Just the storm outside, his ragged breathing, and the small sounds of her working. With every stitch, something in the room changed. The distance that had existed between them, the employer and the forensic accountant, the captor and the liability, the man who dealt in violence, and the woman who dealt in numbers, dissolved stitch by stitch, as quietly and completely as salt dissolves in water. "Why did you come here?" June asked. She was on the fourth knot. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You have guards, a medical team on retainer. You have people in this building you trust more than you trust me." Mercer was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. His voice was exhausted and entirely unguarded. "I don't, not tonight." He watched her hands. "Patterson's brother got in through the east perimeter. The night rotation was compromised. I don't know which of my people are still my people." She tied off the last stitch, cut the thread. "And I'm safer," she said. "You're the only one in this house who doesn't need anything from me." His voice was fraying at the edges. "You're not afraid of me. You're not loyal to me. You're not trying to use me." A pause. "You're just here, working the numbers." June pressed a thick square of gauze over the stitching and began taping it down with careful, even strips. Her hands had steadied. "The door," Mercer said when she'd finished. She looked at him. "The deadbolt mechanism. I had the room modified after the last incident. The lockable side is in the study now, not the hallway." He met her eyes. "I noticed it this morning on the estate schematics. I should have told you then." A pause. "I'm telling you now." June sat back on her heels. She looked at the bathroom door. Through it, she could see the edge of the study door and the round brass deadbolt, the lever facing inward. She stood up. She walked out of the bathroom and crossed the study floor. She stood at the door for a long moment, looking into the dark hallway. The main staircase was visible at the end of the corridor, lit by the low emergency lighting that had kicked on when the storm knocked out part of the grid. 30 steps, maybe less. The front door was 300 square feet of solid Colorado pine, and she knew the access code because she had watched Mercer type it, and she remembered numbers the way other people remembered faces. She stood there for a long time. Then she reached out and locked the deadbolt. When she walked back into the bathroom, Mercer was staring at her. The expression on his face was something she had no file for, no category, no column. It was the face of a man who had been anticipating a loss so long he no longer knew what to do with the alternative. "Get up," June said, and offered him her hand. "The floor is too cold and you're going to stiffen." The fever broke toward dawn, leaving Mercer grey and damp against the pillows. June was at the writing desk with his encrypted satellite phone and her laptop, the thin blue light of the screen the only illumination in the room. She had been there since 4 in the morning. She had not slept. When Zane arrived at 7, Mercer's most senior lieutenant, a broad, flat-eyed man who looked like he'd been assembled from materials not found in nature, he came to the study door and stopped when June opened it. He looked at her, at the dried, rust-colored flakes on her sleeves, at the calm, entirely unremarkable expression on her face. "Where's Mercer?" he said. "Sleeping. He lost significant blood and the stitching held. He's not to be moved or disturbed." June stepped back to let Zane look past her into the room, Mercer visible in the bed, his chest rising and falling evenly, his color slightly improved. "I need a vetted crew on the east perimeter. No one hired in the last 6 months. I've locked down the security feeds remotely, and I'll restore access to zones 1 through 4 when you're in position." Zane looked back at her. "You'll restore access." "I have administrative credentials to the estate system. Mercer gave them to me to audit the operating accounts." She held his gaze. "Patterson's operation targeted the east approach. The perimeter cameras in that zone were manually redirected at approximately 2:20 this morning. I need you to reset them physically." Zane crossed his arms. "I don't take direction from the accountant." June turned back to her laptop. She pulled up a spreadsheet and turned the screen to face him. "You run a secondary distribution line through the Telluride storage units. Units 14, 15, and 22. She let him look at the numbers for a moment. "The revenue from that line has never appeared in the Mercer Holdings accounts. It's been flowing into a holding account traced to your wife's maiden name." She minimized the window. "I found this 4 days ago. I haven't told Mercer because I've been occupied keeping him alive." She looked at Zane steadily. "You can work with me this morning, or I can have this on his desk when he wakes up. Pick quickly. We're losing the daylight window." The silence had weight. "What do I get if I cooperate?" Zane said. "Not a challenge. A negotiation. She could work with a negotiation." "I lose the file. You deposit 60% of the outstanding balance into the Mercer Holdings operating account within 30 days, and we call it a reconciliation error." June closed the laptop. "The alternative doesn't end as tidily." From the bed, Mercer's voice came rough and unhurried. "Do what she says, Zane." Zane looked at his boss, at the accountant standing between them with a closed laptop and no visible weapons and an expression of complete administrative authority. He left without another word. June heard him on the radio before he'd reached the staircase. "Who is she, boss?" Zane's voice carried back down the hallway. "The only person in this building whose books are actually clean," Mercer said, and lay back against the pillows. They had one of Patterson's men in the lower level, a young enforcer named Keller, 26 years old, no prior record, who had given Zane's crew nothing useful across 12 hours of persuasion. Mercer insisted on going down. June looked at his pale, sweat-damp face, the slight tremor in his hand when he reached for his gun, and said nothing. She simply walked to his side, put her arm around his waist, and let him lean on her without either of them acknowledging it. The lower level smelled of cold concrete and motor oil. Keller was zip-tied to a reinforced chair under a halogen light, his face a landscape of bruising. He looked up when they entered. His eyes skipped over June entirely and settled on Mercer. June stepped forward before Mercer could speak. She opened her laptop and turned it so Keller could see the screen. "Thomas Keller," she said. Her voice was completely flat. "Hired by Patterson 8 months ago. Every transaction you've facilitated for his secondary operation left a routing trace. Not a large one. Most auditors would miss it." She scrolled without looking at him. "I'm not most auditors." She started reading account numbers, routing codes, amounts, dates. Keller went the color of the concrete wall behind him. The Meridian warehouse on Route 9, June continued, her voice still light, almost conversational. It processed 2 payments in the last 6 days. Shell Company invoices for HVAC maintenance. She looked up from the screen. In October, in the mountains, for a building that was reported as vacant. She let that sit. The math tells me Patterson is staging his remaining crew there. The math also tells me you know I'm right, because your breathing just changed. The room was absolutely still. Keller broke in under a minute. He gave them the address, the crew count, the timeline. He was crying before he finished his second sentence. Not from pain, but from the specific and terrible realization that the information he'd been protecting had already been assembled, piece by piece, from the trail he'd left without knowing he was leaving it. Money always remembered where it had been. June had told Mercer that once, early in the engagement, when he'd asked how she found the discrepancies that other accountants missed. Money always remembered. You just had to ask the right questions. Outside, in the cold concrete corridor, Mercer leaned against the wall and looked at her. The trip down the stairs had cost him. He was very pale. "You didn't threaten him," Mercer said. "I didn't need to." June closed her laptop. Her hands were trembling now, the adrenaline wearing down to its chemical components, leaving only the tremor behind. The numbers were enough. "They always are with you." She turned away. She felt the single tear tracking down her cheek before she could stop it, and she hated it. Hated the evidence of feeling after she'd held everything so cleanly at arm's length for so long. "June." Mercer's voice was different. Not the boardroom voice, not the 3 a.m. rasp, something stripped down to the frame. "You've been living inside numbers your whole life because they don't ask anything back. They don't leave. They don't make you feel stupid for trusting them." She didn't turn around. "I know," he said quietly, "because I do the same thing with ledgers." The corridor was cold and silent. Somewhere above them, Zane's crew was moving, muffled sounds of preparation filtering through the floor. She turned around. He was watching her with an expression she'd never catalogued on him before. Not the authority, not the exhaustion, not the careful blankness, just a man, seeing her. "Can we finish this first?" she said. The corner of his mouth shifted, barely. "Yeah," he said, "let's finish it first." The breach came at 2 in the morning. June had tracked the pattern in the security logs, the careful, systematic testing of the perimeter that preceded every Patterson operation, and they were ready. Zane's crew was in position. Mercer was in the study, upright against every reasonable medical recommendation, his gun checked and chambered. June had the spare tactical handgun he'd left on the desk. She had never fired anything in her life. "Center mass," Mercer said. He was standing next to the door, back against the wall, weapon leveled at the reinforced wood. He looked at her across the room, where she stood with the gun braced in both hands, pointed at the brass door handle. "Brace your elbows. Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull. Breathe out when you fire." "Center mass, brace, squeeze, breathe out." She repeated it back the way she memorized account numbers, mechanical, exact. The handle rattled. A suppressed shot hit the locking mechanism. The wood splintered around the edges, but the steel-reinforced frame held. A second shot. A third. The door groaned on its hinges. June breathed. The door burst inward. A man in tactical black stepped through, his weapon sweeping the room, his eyes going to the bed first, muscle memory, looking for the body that was supposed to be there, helpless. It was a fatal mistake. Mercer fired twice. The man went down. The second man stepped over his partner without hesitation, weapon swinging toward Mercer, tracking him as Mercer's gun came up, too slow, the wound in his side pulling at his draw, costing him the half-second he didn't have. June did not think. She squeezed the trigger. The recoil snapped up her arms, the sound enormous in the enclosed space, and the man in the doorway staggered. His weapon discharged into the ceiling, a frantic burst, plaster raining down. She fired again. Once more, he folded. The silence afterward was so complete she could hear her own pulse. Mercer lowered his weapon. He looked at the doorway, then at June, still braced, both and knocked around the grip, the barrel pointed at where the man had been. He crossed the room and took the gun gently from her hands. He set it on the desk. Then he pressed his forehead against hers and stood there. Just that, the two of them breathing in the ruin of the room. "I've got you," he said. "You got them. I've got you." She gripped the front of his shirt. He wrapped his arm around her, careful of the stitching in his side, and held on. By morning the estate was secured, and the storm had pulled itself east over the mountains, leaving everything outside clean and absolute in the thin, high-altitude light. A private medical team arrived, restitched Mercer's side, put him on antibiotics, and told him to sleep. He agreed with the specific insincerity of a man who had no intention of complying. When the medics had gone and the room was quiet again, Mercer looked at her from the bed. She was in the chair by the window, laptop open, already pulling the offshore account structure into a format she could use to reconstruct the legitimate revenue flows. "You should leave," he said. June stopped typing. "The roads are clear enough now. I'll have a car brought." He watched her carefully. "I can wire you enough to start clean. Somewhere they won't look. You don't have to carry any of this forward." June set the laptop on the coffee table. She walked to the edge of the bed and stood looking down at him. "Do you want me to leave, Mercer?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she heard the last of the wind die away entirely, the silence it left behind vast and still. "No," he said. "It came out with the difficulty of a word that has been held down too long. But I know what I've done. I know what I've made you part of. I know what I've made you capable of." His jaw was tight. "I should never have kept you here. I ruined you." "You didn't ruin me." June sat down on the edge of the mattress near his hip. "I found your books in week 1. I had everything I needed to hand you to a federal forensic team by the end of week 2. She met his eyes. "I didn't. That was a choice I made before you ever turned that lock." He stared at her. Why? She thought about it honestly, the way she thought through complicated accounts, following each line to its true origin rather than the one it was supposed to have. "Because the numbers told me who you were more clearly than your reputation did," she said finally. "The money you moved, where it went, the hospital bills, the school accounts, the neighborhood renewal fund in the East Side district that traces back to 3 different shell companies that all trace back to you." She looked at the faint rust brown still visible on the backs of her hands. "You're not a clean ledger, Mercer, but nothing about you is what I was told it was." He was quiet. The grey morning light lay across the bed between them. "I don't know how to do this without a cage," he said. His voice was completely unguarded, the way it had been on the bathroom floor at 3 in the morning. "I don't know how to hold something without locking it down." "You don't need a cage." June reached out and pressed her palm flat against his chest, above the bandaging, feeling the solid beat of him. "I'm not here because I can't leave. The door opens from my side, remember?" She held his gaze. "I'm here because I ran the numbers and this is where the math came out." His hand covered hers, scarred fingers, warm, deliberate. "Then stay," he said, "and help me rebuild this into something worth keeping." She looked at him, the exhaustion, the careful hope he was trying not to show, the man who catalogued everything in terms of debt and credit and couldn't calculate this particular exchange at all. "I already found 6 restructuring opportunities in the legitimate portfolio," she said. "We consolidate the Route 9 assets, close the ghost accounts, reroute the offshore holdings through a compliant structure. 3 months, maybe 4. And then..." She reached out and picked up the encrypted satellite phone from the nightstand, pressing it gently into his palm. "And then," she said quietly, "we make this empire clean enough that no one can touch it. Rest today, Mercer. Tomorrow we fix the books." He looked at the phone in his hand, at her. The corner of his mouth moved, not the performative version, not the one he wore for rooms full of dangerous men, the real one. "You're not going to let me be dramatic about this, are you?" he said. "I never let inaccurate entries stand," June said. "That includes the ones where you think you're the only strategist in the room." He laughed. It cost him a stitch, and he didn't care. The phone rested between them on the white cotton of the duvet. She would pick it up in an hour and start making calls. To bankers, to Zane, to the one attorney in Denver she'd identified as actually clean. She would build the new structure the way she built every audit, methodically, precisely, following each line to its true source. But first she stayed there with him in the quiet of the morning and let the numbers wait. June Hartley had walked into Mercer Holdings as a forensic accountant hired to find the gaps. She had found all of them. In the books, in the operation, in the man who ran it. The most dangerous person in a criminal empire was never the one with the gun. It was the one who understood what everything was actually worth, who had stared at the open door, and the open road, and the clean life waiting on the other side, and had chosen, with full knowledge, to stay and rewrite the ledger entirely. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now and share it with everyone who loves a woman who outsmarts the room without raising her voice. Subscribe to Mafia Longing Stories and ring the bell so you never miss the next one. Tell us in the comments, would you have walked out that door or stayed to balance the books?